They called him the silent shadow of Seoul. Seoul didn't have a soul, he had a blade of sharpened steel where it should have been. His manor was a fortress of absolute silence, and his rules were the only law that mattered. Rule number 1, zero interference. No one enters without an invitation, and no one leaves with a secret. But as a brutal gang war turned the city streets into a slaughterhouse, a terrified housemaid committed the unthinkable. She brought a helpless stranger, a young, blind girl named Ryu Miran, into the heart of the monster's sanctuary. The grand marble doors groaned open, letting in the smell of ozone and wet pavement. Miran stood perfectly still, her white cane tapping once against the cold stone. Suddenly, the air turned frigid as heavy, rhythmic footsteps echoed off the arched ceilings. Seoul appeared, his black bespoke suit immaculate, save for the fresh blood staining his knuckles from whatever nightmare he had just walked away from. The maid fell to her knees, gasping for a mercy that never came to this house, waiting for the crack of Guanael's pistol to end their intrusion. But the sound never came. Instead, she heard something impossible. The heavy thud of a weapon hitting the floor. When she opened her eyes, the most feared predator in the city wasn't holding a gun. He was bent forward in a deep, submissive bow, his forehead lowered in total reverence before the blind child. And on his face, for the first time anyone had ever witnessed, were tears. Guanael, the girl whispered, her sightless eyes tilted toward him, her voice carrying a warmth that shouldn't exist in this cold hall. You remembered, he rasped, his voice breaking with an intensity that froze his armed bodyguards in their tracks. Why would the city's most lethal boss surrender his pride to a girl who cannot even see him? What secret debt of blood binds a Mafia don to a blind child he supposedly never met? What do you think is going to happen next? Share your predictions in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video if you're enjoying the story. Comment where you are watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more. The neon pulse of Seoul was a frantic blur outside the windows of the black sedan, but inside, the air was as cold and stagnant as a tomb. Seoul sat in the back seat, his silhouette carved from the shadows of the city he dismantled piece by piece every day. To the world, he was the silent shadow, a man who didn't possess a soul, but rather a blade of sharpened steel where a heart should have been. He lived by a singular, ironclad decree that kept his empire standing: zero interference. His manor was a fortress of absolute silence, a sanctuary where no one entered without an invitation and no one left with a secret. But as Guanael moved through the night, orchestrating a brutal gang war that turned the pavement into a slaughterhouse, the sanctuary of his home was being violated. Inside the manor, a housemaid named Hannah stood in the service entrance, her breath coming in jagged, terrified hitches. She was a woman who lived by the rules, who knew that even a misplaced tea set could result in a cold dismissal or worse. Yet, she held the hand of a young girl who looked like she belonged to a different world, a young black girl named Ryu Miran, whose simple light dress was stained with the soot of the streets and whose eyes were covered by a black blindfold. Hannah, where are we? Miran whispered, her voice a soft chime against the oppressive silence of the marble hall. She didn't sound afraid, she sounded curious, her head tilting as she processed the vastness of the space through the tapping of her white cane. Somewhere safe, little one, Hannah lied, her voice trembling so violently it was a miracle the girl couldn't feel the vibration. Hannah knew the risk. She knew that bringing a stranger, especially a child, into the lion's den was a death sentence. But the streets were no longer an option. The rival syndicates were burning the district down, and Miran had no one else. Hannah had seen the girl huddled in an alley, her cane snapped in half, the world around her exploding in violence she couldn't see. It smells like rain and old paper, Miran noted, taking a hesitant step forward on the polished floor. Hannah hurried her toward the dark corners of the grand hall, away from the arched windows where the moonlight spilled in. She needed to hide her. She needed to tuck this forbidden guest away in the servants' quarters before the master returned. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward them like grasping hands, and every creak of the house sounded like a warning. Stay very quiet, Miran, Hannah pleaded, leaden with the knowledge of what happened to those who broke Guanael's law. In this house, silence is the only thing that keeps you alive. She led the girl toward the back of the manor, passing through the graveyard of Guanael's past, the cold statues and the heavy oak doors that led to rooms no one was allowed to breathe in. Miran followed, her white cane tapping a rhythmic, innocent code against the stone, unaware that she was treading on the most dangerous ground in Seoul. Hannah squeezed the girl's hand, praying to a god she hadn't spoken to in years that the silent shadow would stay in the dark tonight. But deep in the distance, the low, rhythmic rumble of a heavy engine approached the front gates, signaling the arrival of the monster who allowed no strangers in his home. The forbidden guest had entered the sanctuary, and the peace of the fortress was about to shatter. The rhythmic purr of the sedan's engine died as it pulled into the manor's gravel drive, replaced by the ominous, metallic clicking of the engine cooling in the night air. The heavy front doors of the manor didn't just open, they seemed to retreat in fear. Seoul Guanael stepped into the grand hall, his presence instantly draining the warmth from the room. He was a vision of dark, calculated violence. His black suit was sharp enough to bleed, but it was the literal blood, crimson and still tacky, smearing his right knuckles that told the story of the hours he had just spent in the city's gutters. He didn't speak. Guanael moved with a steady, deliberate gait that echoed like a death knell against the marble floors. To the three bodyguards flanking him, he was a god of iron and shadow, a man who had long ago traded his capacity for mercy for a throne of bones. His eyes, dark and predatory, scanned the familiar architecture of his sanctuary, looking for any sign of disorder. Suddenly, Guanael stopped. His nostrils flared as he caught a scent that didn't belong, the faint, floral smell of a child's laundry detergent and the earthy musk of the streets, cutting through his preferred atmosphere of expensive cologne and gun oil. His hand drifted instinctively to the silver pistol holstered at the small of his back. The air in the hallway turned static. Behind him, his men tensed, their hands hovering over their own weapons as they sensed the shift in their master's mood. Hannah, Guanael said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that carried the threat of 1,000 graves. From the shadows near the arched columns of the library, the housemaid stumbled forward. Her face was the color of salt, her hands clasped so tightly together that her fingernails were digging into her skin. She looked like a woman walking toward her own execution. Master, she stammered, her voice failing her. You're home early. Guanael didn't answer. His gaze had shifted. There, standing in a soft ray of moonlight that filtered through the high windows, was the impossible. A young girl, no older than 10, stood perfectly still. She wore a simple light dress that stood out against the dark mahogany of his shelves like a beacon of unwanted light. A black blindfold covered her eyes, and in her hand, she held a white cane, not as a weapon, but as a lifeline. The silent shadow's eyes narrowed into slits of ice. He drew his weapon in one fluid, terrifying motion, the muzzle of the gun leveled directly at the center of the girl's forehead. The guards moved mid-step, flanking the perimeter, their shadows stretching across the floor like reaching claws. Rule number 1, Hannah, Guanael whispered, the sound more chilling than a shout. 0. Interference. No strangers. No exceptions. The girl didn't flinch at the sound of the gun being cocked. Instead, she tilted her head to the side, her ears straining as if she were listening to a melody only she could hear. She began to move, the soft tap-tap-tap of her cane echoing through the hall as she walked directly toward the man who intended to end her life. Hannah let out a stifled sob, her knees hitting the floor in a desperate plea for mercy. But Guanael remained frozen, his finger tightening on the trigger. The predator had found a lamb in his den, and in his world, lambs were only meant for slaughter. But as the girl stopped just inches from the barrel of his gun, she did something no one in the underworld had ever dared to do. She reached out her hand toward his face, her sightless eyes fixed on a point somewhere behind his cold, murderous gaze. The hall was a vacuum of silence, waiting for the gunshot that would maintain the legend of the silent shadow, unaware that the predator was about to face the only power he couldn't kill. The metal of the pistol was warm, hummed with the vibration of a life just taken, but as Miran stepped into the predator's personal space, the air around Seoul seemed to fracture. The bodyguard stood like statues carved from charcoal, their fingers twitching against their triggers, waiting for the signal to paint the marble red. They had seen Guanael execute men for less than a stray glance. They were prepared for the spray of crimson, the dull thud of a body, and the familiar, heavy silence that followed his wrath. But the girl did not stop. She didn't have the sight to fear the black hollow of the muzzle pointed at her brow. Instead, she tilted her head, her nostrils fluttering as she inhaled the scent of the man standing before her. To her, he wasn't a legend of the underworld or a monster of the night. He was a specific resonance of sound, the heavy, rhythmic thrum of a heart that beat with a jagged, familiar cadence. "Little bird," she whispered. The words were soft, barely more than a breath, but they hit Guanael with the force of a high-caliber round. The silver pistol, an extension of his own arm for a decade, suddenly felt like a leaden weight he could no longer support. His fingers, stained with the drying blood of his enemies, went slack. The gun didn't just fall, it surrendered. It skittered across the polished floor, coming to rest in the shadows of an arched column. Behind him, the head of security let out a sharp, confused intake of breath, his own weapon wavering. This was a violation of every instinct they had been taught. A Mafia don did not drop his guard. He did not let go of his steel. Then came the rustle of expensive, heavy fabric. To the absolute horror of the men standing watch, the silent shadow did not just disarm himself, he began to descend. His knees hit the stone with a dull, echoing crack. Seoul, the man who had never bowed to any syndicate or government, was folding his powerful frame into a deep, submissive bow at the feet of the blind child. His forehead touched the hem of her simple dress. His shoulders, usually broad and immovable as the city mountains, began to heave with a silent, violent tremor. The blade of sharpened steel in his chest was shattering, turning back into the raw, wounded flesh of a boy who had been lost in the dark for 20 years. "Guanael?" Miran asked again, her hand reaching out into the empty air. He didn't reach back with his hands, they were pressed flat against the floor in a gesture of total supplication. Instead, he let out a jagged, broken rasp of a sound. You shouldn't be here," he choked out, his voice cracking like dry earth. "Not in this house. Not in this life." "I followed the sound of the rain," she said simply, her fingers finally finding the top of his head. She touched his hair with a gentleness that felt like a physical burn to his skin. "I knew I'd find you. I told Mama the little bird wouldn't stay in the cold forever." The bodyguard stared wide-eyed, frozen mid-step. They looked at each other, seeking permission to intervene, but there was none to be found. Their master was weeping. The man who dictated the life and death of thousands was on his knees, his face buried in the fabric of a stranger's dress, surrendering his empire for a name only a child remembered. In that grand, marble hall, under the soft rays of the moonlight, the hierarchy of the underworld had been flipped upside down. The king had found his sovereign, and for the first time in his life, the silent shadow was afraid, not of death, but of the light that had finally found him. The shadows in the grand hall seemed to deepen, drawing a veil around the kneeling man and the blind girl, isolating them from the stunned enforcers who stood like gargoyles in the periphery. As Miran's hand rested on Guanael's head, the cold marble beneath him seemed to dissolve, replaced by the scorching heat of a Florida summer 20 years in the past. In the silence of his mind, Guanael was no longer the master of a criminal empire, he was a terrified 12-year-old boy, bleeding out in the humid darkness of a Pensacola shipping yard. He had been a runner for a crew that didn't value his life, caught in a crossfire that wasn't his to fight. He remembered the wet heat of the asphalt, the metallic tang of his own blood, and the heavy footsteps of men coming to finish the job. He had closed his eyes, waiting for the end, until a different pair of hands had found him, hands that smelled not of gunpowder, but of cocoa butter and fried dough. Miran's mother, Sarah, had been a night shift cook at a nearby diner. She hadn't asked for his name or his affiliation. She had simply gathered the broken, foreign boy into her arms and spirited him away to a cramped apartment that hummed with the sound of a buzzing refrigerator and the soft melodies of a radio. For 3 months, she had been his entire world. She had stitched his wounds with a steady hand and fed him broth when he was too weak to sit up. She had called him her little bird because of the way he looked when he first arrived, frail, hollow-boned, and ready to take flight at the slightest noise. "Your mother," Guanael choked out, his voice muffled against the floorboards. "She didn't have to save me. I was a ghost. A nobody. She said you had a song in you that the world was trying to quiet," Miran whispered, her fingers tracing the tension in his neck. "She told me stories about the boy who taught her how to say, 'thank you,' in Korean, even when the world gave her nothing to be thankful for. She said your spirit was like a diamond, too hard to break, but so cold it needed a hearth to keep it from shattering." Guanael remembered the day the black SUVs had finally found him. His family's organization had come to reclaim their asset, dragging him away from the only warmth he had ever known. He had seen Sarah standing in the doorway, her eyes filled with a grief that had haunted his dreams for 2 decades. He had tried to scream, to run back, but the iron doors of his life had slammed shut, and he had spent every day since then building a wall of blood and steel to ensure he would never be that vulnerable again. "She kept the debt," Guanael rasped, finally lifting his head. His eyes were bloodshot, his face a map of agony that stripped away every ounce of his silent shadow persona. "The money I sent, the anonymous wire transfers, they were never enough. I thought I could pay back a life with paper." "She didn't want your money, Guanael," Miran said, her sightless gaze fixed somewhere above his shoulder. "She wanted to know if the little bird ever found a sky he wasn't afraid to fly in." A sharp, jagged breath escaped him. He looked at the girl, the living legacy of the woman who had traded her safety for his survival. Sarah was gone, taken by a fever years ago, but she had sent him the only thing she had left. Miran was the personification of a debt that could never be settled in the underworld. She was a debt of blood, not of the kind he spilled in the streets, but the kind that binds hearts together across oceans and decades. Slowly, Guanael stood, though he remained hunched as if bearing the weight of the entire manor. He turned his gaze toward Hannah, who was still trembling in the corner, and then toward his bodyguards, who were watching their god crumble. The vulnerability in his eyes vanished, replaced by a new, terrifyingly focused resolve. The debt he owed wasn't to his syndicate or his pride, it was to the girl standing in the moonlight. He had been saved by a woman who had nothing, and now, as a man who had everything, he realized that his empire was merely a fortress built to protect the sanctuary he was finally about to create. The shift in the manor was instantaneous and absolute, a chilling redirection of the Silent Shadow's legendary focus. Seoul Guanael stood up from the marble floor, but the man who rose was not the same one who had entered the hall moments ago. The vulnerability remained in the corners of his eyes, but it was now armored by a protective ferocity that made his earlier coldness seem pale in comparison. He didn't look at his pistol where it lay discarded in the shadows, he looked at his men, his gaze a silent, sweeping blade that demanded their immediate and total submission to a new reality. "Marco," Guanael said, his voice dropping into a register of authority that vibrated in the very bones of those present. His head of security, a man who had seen Guanael dismantle entire syndicates without blinking, took a reflexive step forward. "From this breath, your life is hers. If a shadow so much as flickers in her direction without my written seal, you will answer to me personally. Do you understand?" Marco looked at the small, blind girl standing in the center of the hall, then back at the blood-stained knuckles of his boss. He recognized the shift. This wasn't a tactical decision, it was a religious one. "She is sacred, master," Marco replied, bowing his head so low he could see the reflection of the girl's white cane in the polished stone. "My life for hers." Guanael turned to the trembling housemaid, Hannah. His expression didn't soften, but the lethal edge had been blunted by a sudden, desperate necessity. "Hannah, you brought her here. That makes you the keeper of the inner circle. Move her belongings into the east wing. The suite next to mine. But master, Hannah stammered, that is your mother's wing. It hasn't been opened in 15 years. Open it, Guanael commanded. The furniture is to be padded. The floors must be cleared of any obstruction. I want the finest silk on the beds and the air kept at the exact temperature of a Pensacola evening. If she stumbles, it is because you failed to see the obstacle. If she is frightened, it is because you were too loud. She is the only guest this house will ever have, and she will be treated as the queen of this empire. He then did something that stunned the room into a second, deeper silence. He reached out and gently took Miran's hand. His calloused, scarred fingers curled around her small palm with the reverence of a man holding a miracle. He didn't lead her, he moved beside her, his body acting as a silent shield, matching her slow, rhythmic pace as they began to walk toward the east wing. The bodyguards fell in behind them, forming a moving wall of black suits and silenced weapons. They were no longer hunters, they were shepherds. As they passed through the grand corridors, Guanael signaled with a sharp tilt of his head to the technicians stationed in the security hub. Within seconds, the manor's sophisticated defense systems were being recalibrated. The motion sensors were tuned to a softer weight, the harsh, industrial lighting was dimmed to a warm, amber glow, and the heavy, metallic shutters of the windows were drawn to seal out the chaos of the city. Inside the east wing, the dust was already being cleared by a flurry of silent, frantic staff. Guanael led Miran into a room filled with the scent of dried jasmine and old memories. He sat her down on a velvet chair, his movements fluid and watchful. For 20 years, he had used his power to build a fortress of fear, but tonight, he began the work of building a sanctuary of peace. He was no longer just the boss of the underworld, he was the sacred guardian of a debt that could never be repaid, and as he stood watch over the sleeping girl, the city outside realized that the silent shadow hadn't gone soft, he had simply found something worth fighting for. The transition in the East Wing was more than a physical renovation, it was a rewriting of the mansion's very soul. In the days that followed, the silent shadow became a man of echoes and whispers. Seoul Guanael had spent his life reading the shifts in a rival's eyes or the twitch of a finger on a trigger, but he soon realized he was functionally illiterate in the world Miran inhabited. Under her quiet influence, he began to learn that power didn't always need to be visible to be felt. The lessons began in the mornings, in the solarium where the sun draped across the marble like a warm shroud. Guanael would sit in a high-backed chair, his body coiled with a tension he couldn't shake, watching Miran move. She didn't navigate the room with the frantic uncertainty he expected. Instead, she moved with a fluid, haunting grace, her head slightly tilted as if she were eavesdropping on the house itself. "You walk too heavily, Guanael," she said one afternoon, her voice cutting through the silence without startling it. She was standing by a vase of lilies, her fingers lightly brushing the petals. "You carry the weight of everyone you've stepped on. It makes the floor groan." Guanael looked down at his handmade leather shoes, then back at the girl. "I have to be heavy, Miran. People need to know when I am coming." "Only if you want them to fear you," she countered, turning her sightless eyes toward his direction. "But fear is a loud sound. It drowns out the truth. Come here. Sit on the floor." The master of Seoul's underworld hesitated, his pride flaring for a brief, habitual second, before he obeyed. He sat on the cool stone, feeling the vibration of the city far below. Miran sat across from him and reached out, her small hands finding his large, scarred palms. She turned them over, tracing the lines of his life with her thumbs. "Tell me what you see right now," she commanded. "I see a garden that needs pruning. I see the sun hitting the dust motes. I see the security detail at the gate," he replied, his voice clinical. Miran shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "No. Close your eyes. Truly see." Guanael closed his eyes, plunging into a darkness he usually associated with nightmares. At first, there was nothing but the thrum of his own heartbeat. But then, guided by the pressure of Miran's hands, the world began to reconstruct itself. He heard the rhythmic hiss-click of the air filtration system. He felt the subtle shift in air pressure as a maid passed through the far hallway. He smelled the ozone of an approaching storm and the faint, bitter scent of the black tea brewing in the kitchen 3 rooms away. "Everything has a vibration," Miran whispered. "The walls, the air, the people. You've spent so much time looking at the surface that you've forgotten how to feel the depth. You think you're in control because you have the biggest gun, but you're blind to the things that actually move the world." As the hours turned into days, the lessons grew more profound. She taught him to listen to the tension in a room, to recognize the discordant note of a lie, and to appreciate the silence that wasn't empty, but full of peace. He found himself discarding his watch. He no longer needed the ticking of gears to tell time when he could feel the sun's warmth moving across his skin. He began to replace the harsh, industrial lighting of the manor with soft, textured fabrics and scented woods, creating a sensory map that Miran could navigate without her cane. But the greatest lesson was the dismantling of his own ego. He realized that for 20 years, he had used his silent shadow persona as a mask to hide from the boy who had been saved by kindness. Miran was stripping that mask away, piece by piece, forcing him to confront the fact that his strength was a cage. He was learning that a man who can hear the heartbeat of a child is far more powerful than a man who can only hear the sound of his own name. In the quiet of the East Wing, the Predator was becoming a pupil, unaware that while he was learning to see in the dark, his enemies were preparing to use that very darkness to tear his new world apart. While the sanctuary of the East Wing thrived on whispers and jasmine, the city outside began to rot with the smell of ambition and blood. In the windowless boardrooms of the northern docks, the news of Seoul transformation had become a currency more valuable than gold. To the rival syndicates, a Mafia boss who drops his weapon is no longer a king, he is a target. But none watched the manor with more clinical hunger than the man known only as the Ghost. He was a creature of pure logic, a rival who believed that a human heart was nothing more than a mechanical failure. The Ghost sat in a dimly lit surveillance van parked 2 blocks from the manor, his eyes reflecting the flickering blue data of a dozen hacked security feeds. He didn't care about Guanael's territory or his money. He wanted to witness the exact moment that silent shadow finally broke. "Look at him," the Ghost murmured, his voice as dry as parchment, as a thermal feed showed the heat signatures of Guanael and Miran sitting together in the solarium. "The Predator is playing house. He's traded his fangs for a blindfold. His gambit was not a direct assault, not yet. He knew that a frontal attack on the manor would result in a massacre. Guanael's enforcers were still the most disciplined in Seoul. Instead, the Ghost sought to turn the Don's new strength into his ultimate kill switch. He had spent weeks analyzing the sensory map Guanael had built for the girl. He had mapped every acoustic dampener, every textured carpet, and every scent-based navigation point. The Ghost understood that Miran wasn't just Guanael's heart, she was now his entire operating system. "The girl is his eyes," the Ghost noted to his lieutenant, a scarred man who shifted uncomfortably at the mention of the girl. "If we take her eyes, we blind the monster. But if we take the monster's ability to protect her, he will tear himself apart for us." The first move of the gambit was subtle, a psychological bleed. Guanael began to find small, discordant notes in his carefully curated sanctuary. A music box in Miran's room that began to play a distorted, slowed-down version of the songs his mother once sang. A single, crushed lily left on the doorstep of the East Wing, its scent replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of industrial bleach. It was a message, "I am inside your peace." Guanael felt the shift instantly. His lessons with Miran had sharpened his intuition to a razor's edge, but now that edge was cutting him. He stood in the center of the grand hall, his hand hovering over the empty space where his pistol used to be, his chest heaving as he sensed the invisible presence of the Ghost. The silent shadow was being haunted by his own silence. "Someone is watching, Guanael," Miran whispered that evening, her hand tightening on his arm as they walked through the corridor. The air, it tastes like copper. The house is holding its breath. Guanael didn't tell her she was wrong. He couldn't. He looked at the shadow stretching across the marble, realizing that by creating a world of soft textures and gentle sounds, he had inadvertently created the perfect hunting ground for a phantom. The ghost didn't need to break down the doors, he was already vibrating in the walls. As the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the manor into a deep, violet gloom, the ghost initiated the final phase of his play. He didn't send a hit squad. He sent a signal. Across the city, every asset tied to the Moretti lineage was suddenly activated, creating a chaotic noise that forced Guanael's security detail to scramble to the perimeter. Left alone in the heart of the manor, Guanael felt the temperature of the room drop. He reached for Miran, but for the first time, his hands shook. He had spent his life making people afraid of the dark, but as a single red laser dot appeared on the wall beside Miran's head, Guanael realized that the ghost had figured out the truth. The only thing more dangerous than a man with no heart is a man who finally has everything to lose. The gambit was set, the board was rigged, and as the lights of the manor began to flicker and die, the silent shadow realized he would have to become a monster once more to save the only light he had ever truly seen. The transition from the amber warmth of the east wing to a void of total, suffocating blackness happened in a heartbeat. It wasn't a flicker or a brownout, it was a surgical strike. 1 second, Seoul Guanael was watching the gentle rise and fall of Miran's shoulders as she breathed. The next, the world was erased. The high-tech hum of the manor's security hub died, the emergency lights, tampered with by the ghost's virus, remained stubbornly dark, and the silence that followed was so absolute it felt like a physical weight pressing against his eardrums. Guanael? Miran's voice was a fragile thread in the dark. She didn't sound panicked, but the sudden absence of the house's ambient hum had left her untethered. I am here, he whispered, his voice cutting through the gloom with the sharpness of a razor. Guanael didn't need his eyes to know that the threat had moved from the perimeter to the heart of his home. He could feel the shift in air pressure, the subtle vibration of the floorboards as boots moved with practiced, lethal silence in the corridors beyond. The ghost was no longer watching, he was harvesting. Guanael reached out, but he didn't grab her hand with the frantic desperation of a victim. He touched her shoulder with a steady, grounding pressure. He realized then that the sightless lessons she had taught him were not just a way to find his soul, they were a tactical manual for this exact nightmare. In a house of shadows, the man who relied on his eyes was a corpse. The man who relied on the vibration of the world was a predator. The lights are gone for them too, Miran, Guanael murmured, his lips close to her ear. But they are afraid of the dark. You and I, we know the way through it. He felt her nod against his arm. There are 4 of them, she whispered, her voice barely audible. 1 in the hallway, 2 by the grand staircase, and one is breathing very softly in the rafters above us. Guanael's blood turned to liquid nitrogen. He hadn't heard the one in the rafters. He had been listening for the heavy thud of boots, but Miran was listening for the rhythm of life itself. He realized that in this pitch-black labyrinth, the roles had flipped completely. He was no longer her guardian, he was her instrument. Lead me, he commanded. The silent shadow and the blind girl moved through the manor like a single, multi-limbed ghost. Miran held his hand, her touch light as a feather, guiding him past the furniture he had padded for her safety. She moved with a confidence that made the darkness irrelevant. Guanael followed, his body coiled, his ears straining to match the frequency of her perception. A floorboard groaned 20 feet ahead. Guanael didn't wait for a visual. He calculated the distance based on the sound's resonance and the scent of gun oil cutting through the jasmine. He moved with a sudden, violent burst of speed, a shadow within a shadow. There was no gunshot, only the dull, sickening thwack of a strike hitting a throat, followed by the sound of a body hitting the marble. 3 left, Miran breathed, her head tilting toward the ceiling. The one above is moving. He's reaching for something metallic. Guanael didn't hesitate. He scooped Miran into his arms and rolled beneath the heavy mahogany dining table just as a silenced burst of gunfire shredded the air where they had stood a second before. The splinters of wood hissed as they bit into the carpet. The Ghost's men were elite, equipped with the finest night vision goggles money could buy, but those goggles relied on ambient light that Guanael had systematically eliminated. They were trapped in a world of static and green-tinted confusion. Meanwhile, Guanael was beginning to see the room through the way the sound of the gunman's breathing bounced off the walls. "He's dropping down," Miran signaled, her hand tightening on Guanael's lapel. The darkness of the manor had become a living thing, a weapon forged from 20 years of Guanael's pain and 6 months of Miran's grace. As the third assassin hit the floor, Guanael realized that the Ghost had made a fatal error. He had thought that by cutting the lights, he would blind the monster. Instead, he had simply invited the monster into a world where the monster was the only one who truly knew how to see. Guanael stood over the fallen attacker, his face invisible in the gloom, his heart beating with a cold, terrifying clarity. The siege was far from over, but as he felt Miran's steady pulse against his own, he knew that the darkness wasn't his enemy, it was his sanctuary. The shadows of the Grand Manor had become a graveyard for the Ghost's vanguard, but the silence that followed the last body's fall was far from peaceful. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of a storm's eye. Seoul Guanael stood in the center of the dark hall, his chest heaving, his ears ringing with the phantom echoes of the struggle. He felt Miran's small hand trembling against his lower back, her fingers hooked into the fabric of his suit jacket. She was the only thing keeping him grounded in a world that had reverted to primal violence. "He's here," Miran whispered, her voice barely a ghost of a sound. "The man with the heart like a clock. He's right in front of us." Guanael's gaze snapped toward the shattered arched windows. The moonlight was a cold, silver blade cutting through the gloom, and there, silhouetted against the dying city lights, stood the Ghost. He wasn't like the others. He didn't hide in the dark, he owned it. In his hand was a long-barreled pistol equipped with a thermal optic that glowed a predatory red. "You've learned some impressive tricks, Guanael," the Ghost said, his voice a dry rasp that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Teaching a monster to feel, it's a fascinating experiment. But feelings are just data points, and yours have made you predictable." The Ghost leveled the weapon. Guanael didn't have his gun, he had traded his steel for a soul months ago. He looked at the red laser dot as it danced across the floor, searching, until it finally found its mark, not on his own chest, but on the bridge of Miran's nose. The world seemed to slow to a glacial crawl. Guanael could hear the metallic click of the sear as the Ghost's finger began its final pull. There was no time for a tactical maneuver, no clever reversal of the senses. In that split second, the silent shadow realized that his redemption wouldn't be found in a school or a legacy of peace, but in a choice. He didn't think, he lunged. The crack of the gunshot was a deafening roar that tore through the sanctuary. Guanael didn't flinch. He didn't dive for cover. Instead, he threw his entire frame over Miran, twisting his body to act as a massive, living wall of bone and muscle. He felt the impact, a hot, white-hot iron rod driven into his shoulder, tearing through the bespoke fabric and deep into the meat of his back. A guttural grunt escaped his lips as the force of the round threw them both onto the marble. He didn't let go. He wrapped his arms around Miran, pulling her head into the hollow of his neck, shielding her small frame from the spray of glass and the secondary shots that followed. Each impact was a new bloom of agony, a sharp, biting reminder of the armor of violence he had once worn to protect himself, now replaced by a shield of love to protect another. "Guanael!" Miran cried, her hands finding the wet, hot slick of blood on his shoulder. Stay small," he rasped, his teeth gritted so hard he felt them crack. The pain was an ocean, but his resolve was a lighthouse. He looked up, his vision blurring, as Marco and the rest of the security detail finally burst through the doors, their own muzzles flashing as they forced the Ghost back into the night. Guanael slumped against the base of a marble pillar, his breath coming in shallow, wet rattles. The predator was broken, his body a map of sacrifice, but as he felt Miran's frantic, living heartbeat against his chest, he didn't feel like he was losing. For 20 years, he had been a man of shadows, a monster feared by everyone and loved by no one. But as the darkness began to close in at the edges of his vision, he saw only her. He had taken the hit meant for the only light he had ever truly known, proving that the silent shadow was dead, and in his place, a man had finally been born. He had paid the ultimate price, not to settle a debt of crime, but to ensure that the little bird would never have to see the darkness he had lived in for so long. The scars on Seoul Guanael's back were a permanent, jagged map of his redemption, but they no longer throbbed with the cold bitterness of his past. 6 months had passed since the night the manor fell into darkness, and the silent shadow had performed his final, most difficult disappearance. He had systematically dismantled his empire, turning over ledgers to the authorities and converting his vast, blood-soaked wealth into trusts that would ensure the city's forgotten children never had to sleep in the alleys he once called home. The manor itself had undergone its final transformation. The heavy steel shutters were gone, replaced by floor-to-ceiling windows that invited the morning sun to dance across the marble. The scent of ozone and gun oil had been banished, replaced by the persistent, comforting aroma of cedarwood, fresh jasmine, and the simple, honest smell of baking bread. It was no longer a fortress, it was a school, a sanctuary for those the world had deemed broken or invisible. Guanael stood in the center of the grand hall, wearing a simple linen shirt instead of his armor-like bespoke suits. He watched as a dozen children navigated the corridors with the same sensory intuition he had learned from Miran. He moved through the space with a slight limp, his body slower than it once was, but his spirit possessed a lightness that no amount of power had ever provided. He was no longer a king of the underworld, but he was a king of this small, quiet world they had built together. "You're standing still again, Guanael," a voice called out. He turned to see Miran walking toward him. She didn't use her cane inside the house anymore, she knew the vibration of every floorboard, the exact distance between every pillar. She stopped in front of him, her sightless eyes tilting up toward his face. She reached out, her fingers brushing the faint scar along his jawline, the only mark of the ghost that remained visible. "The house is humming today," she said, her smile reflecting the light of the sun. "It sounds like a song. It's the sound of a legacy that doesn't require a gun to maintain," Guanael replied, his voice a warm, steady rasp. He looked toward the east wing, where Hannah was leading a group of students through a music lesson. The silence he had once enforced was dead, replaced by a symphony of laughter and learning. He realized then that for 20 years, he had been a man who cleared the streets, but now, he was a man who filled them with hope. He had finally found the sky Sarah had wanted for him, a sky where the little bird didn't have to hide in the shadows. He had traded his fear for reverence and his blade for a steady hand to lead others out of the dark. As the afternoon sun dipped low, casting a golden glow over the marble floors that had once been stained with the debts of his past, Seoul Guanael let out a long, peaceful breath. He took Miran's hand and walked toward the gardens, finally at rest with the name she had whispered in the dark. The silent shadow was a ghost of a different life, and the man who remained was finally, irrevocably, home.